Hi, everybody. I'm very early. I'm just making sure that everything's working all right. So everything seems to be fine. So we will get started promptly as planned at the top of the hour. I am just going to turn off my video and audio for the next few minutes until we're ready to roll. Very excited. I'll be bringing in, we'll have about 10 people in the house, all participants in our course on Deleuze versus Heidegger that we were running over the past couple of months. So I'll be right back. Hi, everybody.
Hey.
Welcome.
How's it going?
I must do one round of the obligatory, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Everyone should maybe say hi briefly, just so I can make sure I hear
Hey
you
there.
okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey, it's Kevin.
Hey, what's going on?
Oh, sorry, my volume was off. All right. Just on time. Everyone seems to be here. Oh, we have Raven joining just now.
Are we
Looks
live on
like the
YouTube?
gang is all here. Raven, can you hear us okay?
Yeah. Hi.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you everyone for coming out. And for people who are listening or watching either live right now or in the future, listening back to the replay, welcome. We are today very pleased and proud, I would even say, to present a concluding seminar at the tail end of the course that I did with Johannes Niederhauser, who you can see here in the room also. We did this over the past couple months, or earlier this year. We did our first online course dealing with Deleuze and Heidegger. I took the Deleuze half and Johannes took the Heidegger half. And it was about several themes in the philosophy of technology. And part of what we did for this course was we had an ongoing seminar and discussion series with people you're going to meet and hear from today. And we were just blown away by how good the sessions were. We were really, really pleased with just extremely high quality contributions from everyone who took part in the course. So we thought it'd be a good idea to invite everyone onto a live stream at the end of our course to kind of conclude and give everyone in the course an opportunity to formulate some of their final thoughts, to present some sort of concluding idea that they're most interested in, that they took away from the course, and that they presumably are going to try to work on to some degree moving forward. So that's the idea of today's session. And if you're coming from the public, thank you for your interest in all of our work. We're all grateful to have you here. So that's pretty much it on my end. For anyone who's interested in the course now or in the future, there's just a link in the description below if you want to check that out. Johannes, did you, by way of introduction, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thanks all for coming again. It's great to see you all again, most all of you. And thank you, Justin. And yes, it was a really wonderful seminar. So it's good to be back and I'm looking forward to learning something. So I've got my pen and paper, so I'm going to be taking notes.
Same.
And then shut you later. No, I'm kidding.
Same. Well, a few more quick words then about the format for today and what everyone can expect. What we're going to do is everyone will take turns giving very short talks in the tech world. These are called lightning talks, where each person will speak for about 10 minutes and really try to provide a kind of condensed statement of some sort of thesis or idea. And we'll do that in succession. So it should take about 90 minutes. And all throughout this time, by the way, I'm going to be monitoring the chat for the YouTube live stream. So if you're watching this live, I will be paying attention. Please, if you have interesting questions or observations, I will be paying close attention. So please feel free to contribute. And at the end, we'll have about a whole half hour to discuss questions or possibly to connect some dots that we noticed between the talks. So once everyone is done, I will kind of bring to the table any particularly good questions that I read in the live stream chat. And perhaps Johannes and I may take a brief stab at some sort of synthesis or summary, kind of concluding comments after everyone's talk. All right. Anyone have any questions, concerns, anything at all? All right. Excellent. Well, let's get into this then. And by the way, I am going to be keeping time and I'm going to be a very strict timekeeper. So I'll give you maybe a 2-minute warning if I think that's necessary. Yeah. All right, everyone. I'm just going to go in the order that I see the faces, if that's okay with all of you. And I see at my top left, Kevin McCoy. So feel free also to maybe start with a very brief introduction about yourself and who you are.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, happy to go first. So yeah, I'm Kevin McCoy. I'm an artist living and working in New York. And so I wanted to just talk really briefly at the beginning about my relationship to the class, as an artist in a philosophy class. And there's a really great Deleuze essay called Mediators, that where he addresses this relationship, this question of the relationship between artist, scientist, and philosopher. He says that all three of those modes are creative and are full of creators, but the type of creation is different. And so in scientists, they're creating functions. In philosophers are creating concepts, and artists are creating what he calls sensory aggregates. And I've always loved that essay and loved that term sensory aggregate as the form of artistic creation. And so this question of the relationship between those things, he explores that a lot in What is Philosophy, but this kind of mode of sensory aggregate. So the concept that I was responding to here is one that Johannes brought up in his first essay and in the early talk around Heidegger's idea of the Gestelle. And the Gestelle is usually translated as enframing, but there's this really great kind of etymological breakdown that he shows that retranslates that term as the gathering or concentration of all positionality itself. And so stellen is this word that means to position, to place, to put, to set. He connects it in the essay to these other German terms. I'm not a German speaker, so I'm going off of him. Vorstellen, to produce, vorstellen, to present, to imagine, to picture, nachstellen, to imitate. And so, and the Gestelle has an everyday meaning of a frame or a support stand or something like that. And so all of those words were really practical words, very much making words. And they really belong to the vocabulary of what an artist does in a day-to-day basis as a maker, as a practitioner. And I'm gonna flip my camera around here. And it really connects up to, there's a work that Richard Serra, the sculptor Richard Serra made in the 60s called Verb List, where he makes this huge list of verbs, of words that describe the kind of practicalities, the material practicalities of making, and this kind of expanded concept of Gestelle and the kind of vocabulary around it really connects up with this. This is on MoMA's website. There it is, Richard Serra Verb List. You can check that out. So during this course, I've been doing a series of, oops, hang on, switch back. Been doing a series of projects that are drawing projects that are using machine drawing techniques or kind of assisted machine drawing techniques to produce these works that are very much in the reality of Gestelle, of pure positionality. So I'm going to show you this, or in fact, I'm going to hand this off to my wife, who's going to run the thing for me. And so this is the machine, and it's a large format plotter. I'm going to turn it on, and it'll be maybe a little bit loud, but we'll see it kind of at work. And so there's this kind of long kind of chain of processing that produces these images that starts with a kind of optical image, but then goes through a series of software transformations through software that I developed that creates these kind of super intense overwrought drawings. And there's an idea that Donna Haraway has in Staying with the Trouble, where she talks about a kind of excess of surface through this idea of hyperbolic spaces that I'm really kind of responding to with this, to create these kind of over density of marks. And so this was all kind of happening in conjunction with the seminar, and this idea of Gestelle was really, I'm going to pause that because it's a little loud. The idea of Gestelle is really became kind of central to that. And so, and I think that these drawings are a way to kind of overload or overcome or kind of go beyond the Gestelle concept through just a kind of excess of surface. And this is an idea to bring it back to Deleuze that he talks about a lot in his Francis Bacon book, The Logic of Sensation. And so in that book, he talks about this kind of work of the painter Francis Bacon, kind of going from what he calls a catastrophe to figuration in this kind of movement. He compares this to abstract expressionism, this movement from catastrophe to figuration, and that all is based on the role of the line or the contour line. And the role that contour line plays, and that's kind of explicitly going on with this. I'm going to show you kind of just two more works here that kind of like are playing with this kind of shifting role of the contour line and maybe kind of going past this Gestelle concept. So like in a drawing like this, where there's this sort of uniformity of surface. There's very little figuration going on. You can't really see the figure. The figure's kind of gone back into this sort of noise floor, you know, of kind of too many lines, a kind of excess of surface. But then in this drawing here, I'm, you know, using color and working, you know, kind of to create figuration, working with this foreground figure and background figure by, you know, kind of by the use of color and modulating this kind of line count a little bit. And this image is of this, started from a view of this World War I memorial statue that's in the park down the road from our studio. And I was attracted with this because it's a kind of Walter Benjamin angel of history. If you know that reference, where his response to a Paul Klee drawing, where he creates this beautiful image of the angel of history, kind of facing catastrophe and kind of blowing backwards through you know, kind of through this kind of you know, horrible concept of progress that he's critiquing in that. So you know, that's my presentation, more of a, not a theoretical statement, but a kind of artist sensory aggregate production. And I'm happy to see what other folks have to say.
All right, that's amazing. That's so fun to be able to kind of be in your workshop with you and see all of that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. Well, welcome. Anytime.
Excellent. Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Kevin. I'm going to hold back my instinct to comment and raise questions to stay on an orderly schedule. And of course, to be fair to everyone. So thanks so much, Kevin. That was great. I think we're just going to keep going in succession. Next up, I see Mark.
Hello, everybody. My name's Mark. I studied Heidegger a fair bit, and most of my interest is in the philosophy of artificial intelligence and what philosophy and AI research have to say about each other to inform each other, and how maybe even they could test the predictions of each other. So my concern with all this is how one can get something about modern AI out of the question concerning technology, because it is definitely the technology of the hour. It's the thing everybody's talking about. It's making leaps and bounds when things like material science seem to be stuck in the... Heidegger has been used to talk about AI a fair bit. Hubert Dreyfus is famous for writing about how Heidegger is necessary to progress from symbolic AI. But those engagements of Heidegger and AI, strangely enough, didn't really take into account his later writings on technology. They were all about the concept of world, the concept of care, that sort of thing. And so when it comes to his question about technology, we should ask, if we're going to evaluate it as a theory, has it had predictive power? Has it shown us has it told us anything about the way in which technology has actually developed since those days? So where should we expect to see technology going if Heidegger's right about enframing? The core of enframing's challenge to us is to order the world. We quantify and calculate and then place the world in order to make use of the standing reserve. So science after Heidegger went very quickly into the development of quantifying and computing machines. And the modern development of those is AI. And we can see when we look with Heidegger, we have to ask why AI is going the way it's going, not in terms of the necessity of its coding or whatever, as Dreyfus is looking into, but how AI is developing as a social enterprise of research and implementation. So AI is artificial intelligence. It's an imitation of the human. But for us under technology, that has to be an imitation of how technology understands the human being, how enframing sees us as the being that it challenges to order the world. So AI quantifies, calculates, and orders. It takes our job. We've talked, there are all kinds of worries about automation and AI affecting the labor supply, but AI is not just, would not just take away from truck drivers, it takes away most fundamentally from the people whose work is closest to enframing, closest to ordering the world. And Oh, and that means that its relationship to its AI's relationship to its own essence is different from past technologies. For the first time, technology is coming to participate in its own essence, to respond to the challenge which gave it life directly, rather than through the mediation of human beings. However, if AI is going to replace us, it can only replace us in spheres where our consciousness is totally commanded by enframing already. For instance, a central planner's office or a trading desk where the reality is already quantified and processed into data. So, for instance, for instance, Heidegger's example of the radio board. The radio board is incapable of doing away with the radio because that would be to go against the challenge of enframing. And those people are already in their work as the radio board, totally commanded by enframing, and can be replaced by an artificial intelligence. So then we have to ask, what are the dangers? Because Heidegger is always very alert to the dangers. And those dangers have been trodden over many, many times by AI researchers, by people talking about automation, existential risk, that sort of thing. But I also want to think about the possibilities. In our fear of AI, we may be forgetting the potential of humanity, and Heidegger can wake us up again to that potential. As the essence of technology differs from ours, its potential differs too. The transformation of AI is one internal to technology. Human beings are on the sidelines, we are shunted aside. So, and then when we're no longer necessary to enframing, its grip on us might slacken. The forester is still commanded by enframing, by the dictates of an artificial intelligence set up in some distant data center, but he's not the one doing the ordering. He has to find a new and perhaps freer relationship to the forest around him, precisely because his role as orderer has been taken away from him. In this way, technology might free us of the spiritual hardships of enframing, just as it's freed us from many physical hardships. So in that way, the loss of our position in the framework is not necessarily a loss of agency, whether personal or historical. It is the end of one path, the path that technology has drawn us down. But the end of a path is also the opening up into a clearing and the choice of many new paths. We will come out of this transformed in ways we can't understand, perhaps the resurrection of old psychospiritual or cultural forms, perhaps the discovery of new ones, perhaps the mutation of what we have already. But we will find new paths. We'll find new paths out of technology as long as we're willing to go through it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for such thoughtful comments. As I said before, that was really great, but I'm going to keep moving forward and not allow myself to say the many interesting things I would love to say in response to all of these talks. You do have a little bit of time, Mark. I don't know if you wanted to add maybe anything else.
I guess since I'll also go over some of the dangers that I think people aren't necessarily seeing so much.
I mean, just a minute or two, just so you know, just letting you know,
yeah.
in case you wanted to squeeze any last point in there.
No, this is just that we have to remain alert and open to our possibilities. We can't allow technology to take us away from the potential of the paths we're going down. We have to remain alive and open to the sort of ideas we're discussing right now. We have to care about them as more than just interesting distractions and diversions.
All right, absolutely. Thank you for adding that closing remark. Excellent. All right, so as I said, we'll just keep going down the line then. Next up I see on my screen would be Giovanni. Giovanni, please take it away.
All right, very well. I'm Giovanni, and I'm a blogger, writer, and sort of the last thing that I was reading of was on Deleuze, on his book on Two Regime of Madness, and on his section, The New Philosopher. I was sort of stricken by the way he sort of took care of the notion between philosophy and marketing, which was really interesting, because if we think about, the marketplace of ideas, how do we get into this marketplace? Should we treat philosophy in the same way, we treat like a service or a product in the marketplace? And he says that, he wants to take care of us pretty much on how we do philosophy. So basically, he basically wants us to be careful in this sort of way we attempt to kind of like, Heideggerianize this and Hegel, Hegel that, and it kind of want us to come up with our own creative ways of thinking, and kind of how Heidegger says here that in the ways of thinking in the turn, how must we think? For thinking is genuine activity, genuine taking a hand. If to take a hand means to lend a hand to the essence, the coming to presence of being. And so, yeah, with that, I like the way Heidegger explores the relationship between cause and effect. And so the way we generally think about cause and effect is sort of the Aristotelian way, which he says the effect as its consequence is called a cause. And so for many generations, that's kind of how we think of it. It's kind of like a point A to a point B. And so Heidegger says that it should not only be the cause, but the means by which something is affected is considered as cause. And so this brings up this notion of Deleuze with the way he sees process. So as the process keeps going, the transactions, whenever we transact, it automatically changes the process from the very beginning. And so this is what he calls a miraculating machine. And so when we think about, like, for example, a surface where the nomads, the despot takes over the nomads and starts to stride the space, another surface is built on top of that, of which it appropriates itself. So now we kind of have this concept of overcodes, right? So codes transfer between two spaces, two regimes, and then we have a surface that kind of emanates on its own. So now we have this concept of overcode and this concept of the thing that returns, which I'm going to bring up later, a gift that sort of returns. And I really love this word that Heidegger uses, occasioning, because it seems that sort of being, kind of suffers from this occasioning. It says that that passes over forth into presencing from that which is not presencing. It's called poiesis, right? And I also like the way he treats nature, because it seems that with nature we can kind of abstract physics, and there it seems that we impose a kind of order to nature, and there's like a unit of nature, right? And so we kind of tend to confuse that with nature, and then there's like physics, and then there's biology, and so we kind of have to be careful with how we perceive nature. But yeah, I like how Mark was talking about how technology is beginning to participate in its own essence, right? And so here I want to bring this sort of concept with what kind of I'm working on. So I'm working on with this conflict between people, which is transactioning. So we have come to a point where transactions are beginning to like make us suffer in a way. And here is an important part where Nietzsche sort of says that everyone suffers, even animals suffer, right? And so what distinguishes us from an animal is that not only that we suffer, but we have the ability to suffer profoundly. And it seems that we're kind of stuck in this kind of general suffering when it comes to transitioning or transaction. It necessitates a suffering. But what's really cool about Nietzsche is that he sort of leaves this realm of pleasure and desire that Deleuze and Guattari seems to kind of like talk about, and it's almost as if it frees us. It frees us from the kind of pleasure that we seem to be trapped within, like the capital society. So yeah, that's kind of with what I want to leave with here. That it seems that technology kind of takes this ultimate form of already being there. And so our image sort of wants to be in that position, to be in that place where we align ourselves in favor with history. And so this is what I mean when we say that our being sort of suffers from this occasioning, right? We kind of already want to be there. And in that sense, that's how we sort of tend to lead. That's how we want other people to know with what, how we are. And so a lot of people would says that, Anti-Oedipus, the book that I'm kind of reading with Deleuze, is sort of a theory of desire, right? But I sort of see it as a very cool geometrical concept that is all about positioning. So it's where we position ourselves and how it makes us vanish. And so Marshall McLuhan actually talks about this, where he says, when we sit in front of the television, it is us who begins to vanish. We are the vanishing point. And if you know anything about McLuhan, he was, doing all these studies during the big media companies that began to conglomerate, and sort of the television was seen as an access point to the rest of the world, so that when we sit in front of the television, it seems as if we are kind of participating in an isolated area, but it brings into effect this vanishing act that we tend to confuse with, the essence of lack, the object that that disappears into, the forms, or, the quote unquote real world. We sort of tend to confuse that with the essence of lack, that the object. So we're stuck with the object now when we desire it, right? And so we actually vanish. That is his point, right? So is that we vanish. And the reason this sort of tends to happen is because we confuse this sort of cause and effect, right? And he also brings up this, how the effect comes first, Marshall McLuhan. So we have the gyroscopic balance of the bicycle, for example, which led to the car, and then which led to the airplane, and how it balances in midair. But you had to have the effect first. So the bicycle, and then the car, and then the airplane, which can now like sort of balance in midair. And so that is how I like to think about it, with this geometrical aspect of positioning. Now, when it comes into sort of us as beings, how are we controlled by sort of the ground moving? We begin to vanish. But yeah, that's sort of my thing.
Yeah, wonderful. Since you do have about 1 minute left, I'm wondering if maybe what you'd like to do is just in 1 or 2 sentences, could you bring that back to marketing, which is what you started off with?
Yeah, so what I'm working on is sort of the concept of the social salesman, right? So we kind of think of a traditional salesman as a guy who makes an offer with the currency as time and space. If you think about a business, you want to make the as much money with as little time as possible. But the social salesman, his currency is space. That is how he. So the thing that returns comes in a sort of in a different space. The two spaces that I was talking about before, the comparative spaces where codes sort of compare and transfer, and then the appropriated space, which it sort of returns overcoded, right? And so the conflict that I was talking about with people is to get the person into a state of like thoughtful retaliation, so that the person that returns, the gift that returns, returns involuntarily at one space and voluntarily at the other space. So now there's a double bind, right? The impossible thing that, seems to go on.
All right. Excellent. Thank you so much for those remarks, Giovanni. And very good ending. That was a perfect combination of clarity and just kind of tantalizing mysteriousness. So very interesting. Thanks, Giovanni. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
And all right, moving forward, the next person I see on my gallery view is Mario. Please, Mario, take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mario Veen, and I'm an interdisciplinary philosopher. What that means is that I'm trying to connect through philosophy different disciplines to each other. And with disciplines, you can understand scientific disciplines, but you can also take it in a broader way, like how to connect philosophy with spirituality, spirituality with science, science with politics, politics with art, art with philosophy, how to connect everything with everything else, basically. So that's also a challenge, because what to focus on if I kind of want to focus on everything. So I thought I'd focus on the thing that is I see coming back everywhere, which is being yourself or being itself. So the question of being yourself or being itself, that's something that you encounter everywhere nowadays. So obviously, if you go to the self-help section in bookstores, you see all these books about how to be yourself, how to become yourself, which is very nice because it echoes the motto from Heidegger, which he took from Nietzsche, become who you are, which is a very strange motto, because how can you become who you are? Aren't you yourself already? Well, if you look at that section in the New Age bookstores, then obviously there's a lot of people who say you're not. So this is an example for spirituality, but in science, you can see it too, because science tries to focus on the facts themselves. So when we are thinking about now about the coronavirus, what scientists are busy with is to find out, okay, we have humans who are sick, and we see all these symptoms, and but what is the virus itself? What is the mechanism itself through which it works? So the fact that you're coughing or that you're having trouble breathing, that's one aspect of it, but that's a representation of it. So science as well tries to get to the core of this. So I could go on, but perhaps you can see yourself how in one way or another, we're always busy with this itself, which again is very strange, because isn't that the default state? And in fact, yes, I think it is. If you look at most spiritual sources, at least the ones that I read and that I like, but you can find it in a lot of places, then they say, yes, this is the default state. You are itself. And actually not being yourself is kind of the condition that we find ourselves in now in life on Earth in all kinds of different ways. You can find it in philosophy as well. Just as one example, the Stoics, the ancient Greek tradition, there's something there in there too about if you accept who you are, if you accept everything around you and you accept your place in it, what you can see is that you're one piece of the puzzle that is actually part of the whole cosmos. So there's something in which the Stoics said, and well, I could go on, but I think you probably get the point. So the question I want to ask is, what do we do with this? Because obviously we're all focused on it in some way or another. And I would say that we're maybe not very successful in it, because otherwise we would have solved it all. Or maybe there's another option, which is that it's something that you cannot solve for once and for all. There's no one political movement, no one book, no one scientific discipline that can solve that, because in fact, everyone needs to do that for themselves. So that's another option, which I really like. So just to make a connection, because obviously being yourself, that's a whole a huge area about which you can speak in many different ways. For example, in spirituality, you would probably focus more on feeling, and in science you would probably focus more on knowing. But since we've been discussing Heidegger and Deleuzian discourse on philosophy, we can think about thinking. So I think that in philosophy and thinking, one of the biggest challenges for thinking is distraction. And thinking, the moment if you've ever tried to meditate and you've tried to stop thinking, you know what I mean. Because the more you try to stop thinking, the more you think about everything else. The more you focus on solving a problem sometimes, the less you see about it. And you need to have a kind of distance in order to be able to see what it is. So one way to look at thinking is as something that represents. So representing means not being yourself. It means using the word is. X is Y. That's the way thinking works usually. So that's also how you can get breakthroughs. So when Einstein thinks, E is mc squared, that's representing mass through energy and energy through mass. So I think I'm almost running out of time, but the summary of what I think, at least a direction you can think about, is to think about the place for thinking. And this is not a thinking that represents in that way, because thinking can also do that. You can use thinking to communicate, to be strategic, to be instrumental. But it's a thinking that listens. And Heidegger expresses part of this idea in a quote where he says that we have to take a step back from the thinking that merely represents, and even a thinking that explains, because we use thinking to explain what is happening, but it's a thinking that responds and that recalls. And actually, when I think about responding, I think responding is opposed to reacting. So we're used to reacting to what is happening. But what does it mean? I'm just asking a question. I don't have the answer. What does it mean to respond to what is happening rather than reacting? And that is one question. So what does it? So one thing, if you go to the New Age section of that bookstore, it means like take a breath or do some meditation, or make sure that there can be a space between what happens and what you do. The other thing that Heidegger says is that it's a thinking that recalls. So it's a thinking that remembers. So perhaps that is connecting to what I started with, that what many people say is that this is the default situation, being yourself. Perhaps this recalling is only remembering what you have already known all the time, and you have to do this again and again. So that's a question I want to close with, is what does that mean for yourself to have a thinking that takes a step back and that is more about silence and that leaves space and that responds and recalls.
Very nice.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mario. Thank you for, so much to think about there. It's so hard for me to hold back my instinct to comment and question. All these talks are giving me so many ideas. It's quite hard for me to hold them back. Thank you, Mario. That's great. All right. Next up I see is Joshua. Joshua, take it away.
Hey, great. Thanks a lot, Justin. Appreciate it. So I'm Joshua Hansen. I'm going to be speaking about the university, about academia as a society of control. And I'm going to be drawing from Deleuze, Heidegger, and then I'm going to throw in a little Horkheimer and Adorno. And so I'm going to start with Foucault's identification of the classic disciplinary site. So we have the school, factory, prison, barracks, clinic, and so forth. And Foucault emphasizes domain-specific rules and mechanisms that encourage self-monitoring. And so when those rules and mechanisms are extended past the physical place, this is where Deleuze starts identifying the society of control, particularly with the formation of cybernetic feedback loops. And so I believe this is an interpretive lens that can help illuminate some of the present challenges and threats As we basically all know, academia is awash with a free-floating barrage of data, constant social reputation updating mechanisms, optimization metrics, total quality management. There's like this vague sort of desire to implement the latest like Six Sigma style agile fad, or add to the 360-degree performance assessment process, that's basically operating at the cyclic rate on repeat, seemingly forever. And so as soon as US News and World Report spits out some new metric, then you have a whole legion of zombie bureaucrats running around trying to trick it out and so on and so forth. And so, productivity metrics, publish or perish, peer review rigging and citation ranks, everything kind of points at productivity for its own sake. And, we haven't even gotten into the student loan sharking racket. And, it basically limits the future of the student before it even, truly kind of gets off the ground. And it kind of seizes, like mold shapes, imprints their consciousness with this hollow corporate ethos. And so it is this that, I'm claiming is kind of in the species of what Heidegger calls Gestelle. And obviously I'm drawing from Johannes's video on the subject matter. And, so Gestelle as enframing positionality, a view to the world, other people, even in some cases oneself, as standing reserve or resource waiting for exploitation. I really like the analogy Heidegger uses, where it's the river or the stream in the forest. That's no longer river or forest. It is a possible paper mill that's going to operate at a profit, and it's going to churn out newspapers that will create a ready-made set of popular opinion available on demand. And I think we haven't really changed much. The mountain, it's no longer a mountain, it's a mine for tungsten and cobalt and, components of the digital devices we have that only extend these sort of bureaucratic, technocratic controls and give entirely new meaning to the notion of on demand, right? And I also, the best way to capture this whole thing, I think, or at least like what the overall sort of ethos is articulated by both Deleuze and then Mark Fisher in Capitalist Realism, where they speak of students being strangely motivated when applying for unpaid internships, basically. And I think this is also a great way to understand the decline of the university as a site of moral self-cultivation to basically what is today a network of vocational training centers. What's more, the university has increasingly become a nexus where the society of spectacle meets the cult of celebrity. And so this is the march of the culture industry onto the campus and into the classroom, culminating in the sociological analysis of reality television. The best example of this is from about 10 years ago, where you had Schnooky of Jersey Shore fame was invited to give a talk at Rutgers University. That says something in itself. However, they paid Schnooky more than they paid Toni Morrison for a similar talk, and Toni Morrison was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. So this just gives you an idea what the overall sort of like structure of value or like the axiological situation is, so on and so forth. If you look at some of the courses offered in the university for the past 10 or 20 years, I am cherry picking these, I totally acknowledge that. You can find some really wild stuff. So you have Lady Gaga and the sociology of fame, zombies in popular media, the sociology of Miley Cyrus. There was a course offered, I won't say where, on alien sex. There was also at Tufts, they had a course called Demystifying the Hipster, right? So you can take that course. The thing here is that these all make sense in the logic of social science, and I totally acknowledge that. But when you think about John Dewey's theory of collateral learning, basically the methods come to shape the enduring attitudes of the student. So by way of example, Purdue University in the past 3 years or so did an analysis of their university computing resources, and they found that only 4% of their university computing network was being used for academic purposes. And then they limited a whole bunch of streaming functionality last year, right? And so basically, if we look to Marshall McLuhan and the idea that the medium is the message, the message on US college and university campuses is increasingly mindless entertainment laced with advertising messages paid for by private interests. And so now one question could be, have we gotten better? You know, that was like 10 or 20 years ago. Have we gotten better? No, I don't think. I don't think that we have. 2 weeks ago, Inside Higher Ed reported that a coterie of scholars from universities such as Stanford and Georgetown were going to be getting together to do a computational textual analysis of the Babysitters Club, right? So obviously they're going to be seeking to do an ideological unmasking of the work, kind of like unraveling some of the hidden presuppositions and so forth. Good to go. I'm just claiming that it may be possible to do a more interesting and potentially radical emancipatory ideological unmasking, although the ideology to be unmasked here is why we have, you know, college professors reading the Babysitters Club while the university is morally collapsing, right? And I understand you can justify this in the logic of social science. You can justify it by, you know, the logic of grant writing and stuff like this. But what nobody can justify is basically why we have, you know, bourgeois academics teaching mostly well-to-do students about reality television while surrounding communities are in shambles. Nobody wants to talk about that one, right? So basically what happens is that the entertainment comes to reinforce the consumption reinforces the entertainment, the education then ends up becoming a type of luxury entertainment and conspicuous consumption, basically. So where the heck am I at? We're in danger of creating a class of apex super consumers, right? That demand a sort of nonstop live stream of dopaminergic stimulation. And by the way, a lot of these students, unfortunately, are sacrificing a large portion of their future earnings in order or to receive a type of like anointing and an induction into what's sometimes called the global petty bourgeoisie. So are there lines of flight? Are there vectors of escape? I think that there are. I think that's what's presently happening. I think we're looking at least, we're looking at the death of the university, at least as we now know it. And basically it's getting decoded, deterritorialized. It's being subverted and circumvented by small groups of self-directed learners across the digital intellectual semiosphere. And, you know, there are significant, you know, there's cause for celebration, but there's also some serious challenges. How are we going to educate for democracy? You know, can we preserve some sort of substantive reason? You know, these are very important questions, but nevertheless, as at least the outer portions of the ivory towers begin to collapse, and the people that we as a society, the people that we call wise, are busy reading the Babysitters Club because that is what they are doing. I propose that we consider some of Deleuze, you know, the diagnosis he lays out in the postscript. Here's what he says: there is no need to fear or hope, but only to look for new weapons. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you to Justin. Thank you to Johannes, everybody else involved in the whole thing. I am out of here.
All right. Awesome. Awesome.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Josh. We always count on you for high energy and often quite funny talk. So that was great. I'll unpin you there. Thank you so much. Moving forward. Who wants to go next? Well, I'm just going in succession, so you have no say over the matter. And next up I see is Alex Talon. Alex Talon, nice haircut. Take it away.
Hi. Hey, Justin. Hey, Johannes. Good to see everyone from the course. And yeah, it's great to be here. And yeah, I'm kind of, I'm just going to kind of riff on some personal journeys in music and music technology and kind of the lines between artistry and artisan. And I've been thinking about Deleuze nomadology, and I was reflecting on a process that I went through with mastering. And so mastering is basically at the end of music, after one has recorded individual tracks, you have a stereo track that is just the left and right channel, and you go to you try to optimize that track for all listening environments, and often this requires a different set of ears to do this. And you you would go to someone who has golden ears and this fresh perspective, and this process is now being automated. There's a service called Lander that's like an algorithmic mastering service that basically you can feed your track to it and ask ask it to perform the process in different ways, and it spits something back at you, and then you can decide if you like it. But I wanted to kind of talk about what older versions of the process and some experiences with that. And so I worked on a record. So I didn't start this with, I'm an audio engineer as well as a music producer. And so I've been involved at different stages of making music. So whether that's recording, or whether an artist is bringing something to me and I'm mixing, or whether that's me doing the entire process, right? So going back to the mastering. So I'm going to describe a process of basically like an older process of mastering that is starting to be phased out through some of this automation. So I went to this mastering engineer, Bernie Grundman, who could be considered a, if we're going to talk about like, he would be considered, so there's a distinction between kind of, nomad science and royal science or imperial. And I think that if one was, one could place him in a kind of in the imperial, in this, even though he's a person who's developed his own abilities, but just in the sense of, if there's a hierarchy in the world, he would be one of the top 5 in the world. And so, but I wanted to like, I was thinking about this passage in Nomadology where they say that artisans are complete only if they are prospectors. And one of the details that I remembered from visiting him that was so interesting was that he basically had this lab at his mastering studio that was a technical department where they would do these modifications of his equipment. And some of them were very strange and not scientific, in the sense that they were performed by people who had engineering knowledge, but they weren't determined by criteria of, why does this work? They were purely, some of these decisions were just through listening. And so there were certain technologies he employed that were very strange and almost magical, where there were like carved wooden crescents that he would put underneath these bundles of cables that, and when I was asking him like, well, what would the difference be between like a square and this crescent? And, the only difference was, well, we listened to both and we all agreed that the crescent sounded better. And so, and I think there's a lot of ways where someone could look at this and they start seeing weird, like mystifying things that maybe make the artists feel better when they're there. But I think this idea of just that he's purely listening to it. And so going back to the thing of the artisans are only complete if they're prospectors. So he was also sourcing different metals and crystals to change his equipment so that, okay, there's a stock crystal that's going to be in the word clock that is determining the jitter of the stability of a digital signal, and he's going to experiment with putting different crystals in it, and it's kind of just this I don't know. There's something inspiring about the way of that he's just listening to it, and that's the anyway. So that's its own kind of box. But I kind of wanted to talk about the changes in formats in music and the ways in which what freedoms that opened up and what that closed. So if we're looking at kind of like this maybe distinction between royal and nomadic science, I think that like something like vinyl and cylindrical recordings were more associated to me with royal science, in the sense of you could be wrong in a way that was very wrong. The way you could be wrong with vinyl was if you put too much bass on the vinyl, it would literally pop the cartridge off of the vinyl and be unable to play the frequency you had attempted to record and recreate. Then once you went to so the amount of forgiving in the format was not very forgiving in certain ways. So everyone thinks of vinyl, they think of this curve, which is in some ways forgiving because there's rounded highs that dull the highs, and there's a bass boost. So there's a very pleasant listening profile, but yeah, it could literally jump if you put too much information on it. Then when you get to tape, you were always, and tape and vinyl, you were fighting against noise. And so the noise would be everything you were doing, you were trying to minimize noise because the noise would keep adding up. And but there was a mushiness that was that people have come to fetishize and be in love with, because it was also forgiving in certain ways. Once you got to CD, you suddenly had a problem of noise being noise was now like, you had to fight against noise because there was increased bandwidth in the highs where the noise was totally apparent. So there was this push towards a kind of sterilization and making sure that you had no noise so you could have an openness, a clarity, but the spectrum increased. So you had sort of like a new areas to fill, new low end to fill, new highs to fill, although you initially had to fight against a kind of brittleness. And then you get onto, tape cassette, and which also has this kind of like, mush that is, that's a helpful mush. And it's a very kind of democratic format in a way that's similar to digital being very democratic. Although in digital, you then have you basically have the ability to, you have a false, in a way, a false sense of the infinite. You have a false sense of the infinite in the sense that you now have like infinite recording times, but but there's limitations that come with that. And so I was reflecting on different people I've worked with and their approaches to that. And one artist that I worked with, his approach to it, which seems completely counter to what the format would allow, was he would constantly be permanently deleting files. So as you would perform a take, you would basically have to commit in the moment to it being worthy or not, and then deleting it, this is completely different than another way you could work with digital, which would be you record everything and then you harvest from that. I think both are valid, but there's something interesting about that deleting is kind of like imposing the logic of tape or earlier recordings or film recording or anything that had this kind of expensive medium with a finality or with like a ticking clock on it in a certain way. Yeah, so I think there's something interesting to explore in this idea of like, kind of like being able to freely impose the spirit of one recording technique on another, but you can only appreciate that spirit from being outside of it, in the sense of no one was appreciating those limitations from being on the clock in the studio with the tape running out. You could only appreciate the limitations from a later place. And yeah, trying to wrap up, there's a talk that I would recommend between Mark Fisher and Green Gartside from the band Scritti Politti, where they talk about the basically like, once you could move things in milliseconds, you could start to hear things in milliseconds. And so, and there's these, I think that there's this exciting thing about technology when you're first engaging with it, and then there's the tediousness of being fully within it and subsumed by it, and then there's the, you know, way you can fetishize it when you're far away from it, and way that you can try to revive it somehow across the divide of being in a totally new process. And anyway, yeah, I didn't really connect that much to the Deleuze and Heidegger course, but those were all things that I was thinking about a lot in relation to them, and I felt like I feel like there's some resonances with them. But
yeah, for sure, certainly some resonance.
Yeah, no, definitely.
There's no obligation for any of the panelists to link back to the course per se. It's very obvious the resonances. So yeah, and those are interesting anecdotes that you give us to reflect on. So thank you, Alex.
Thanks.
Very good. All right. So moving on then, shall we? And there will be some time left over, so we can circle back to anything. You know, if there was something in someone's talk that they forgot to say, or something that they wanted to return to and really kind of drive home in some way, then there should be some time at the end. So just everyone keep that in mind. All right. Next up, we have Drew, who looks like he's in his MMA gym. Is that right?
We're at the dojo. We're in the dojo.
That's awesome. Take it away, Drew. It's all you.
My name is Drew. I'm a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and a gym owner here in Houston, Texas. And I really enjoyed the course. The lectures were really dense and had a lot to work with. I really appreciate you guys putting on the course. And it's really helped me kind of put my life in a little bit of perspective as well, and just help me develop the idea of jiu-jitsu being a piece of reconfiguring people away from technology, or to handle technology. I think it's an art that points back to mortality in a physical and tactile way, not a contemplative or reflective way. It is to perform martial arts, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in particular, is to be in tune with, not distracted by a combination of senses, leading to a mode of being that it excludes false pressures of existing. I'd say expert level Jiu-Jitsu practitioners evaluate, execute, or respond to truth in a way that reflecting and contemplating doesn't necessarily do. And this decision making comes from a sense of idleness in the face of danger, which is a fundamental sense of danger, not a technological type of danger, which, but I'd say it's not just a flow state. It's not just chasing this flow state too. In jiu-jitsu, you come to reality in a real sense of your mortality of your physical body. And I think just being in that mode leads to you to force through your grips with the limitations of your mortality. And that, I think, can lead to a clearing of poetic existence. Every sparring session in jiu-jitsu, I'll go into a little bit about Brazilian jiu-jitsu in general, but in every sparring session, you get to decide if you enjoy what you're doing. You get to decide to do what's necessary. You get to come to grips with a type of suffering that may be actually a physical pain that you can come to grips with in a different way. And instead of being trapped by this suffering that technology imposes on you, to feel a tactile suffering, I think, can help ease into what actually suffering is, and not in a way that you just turn it on and turn it off, or like just meditate for 3 minutes a day, but more, I mean, jiu-jitsu in general, it has this idea of a lifestyle. And I would say the Brazilian culture, I study Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and most people say there's a lot of discrepancy of what is jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, Japanese jiu-jitsu, judo. And one of the great aspects about jiu-jitsu is how little rules there actually are. And what's cool about jiu-jitsu right now is it's kind of like an explosion of new types of tournaments and matches and rules. But the main ethos of jiu-jitsu is no time limit, submit the person. Jiu-jitsu is for fighting too. What we practice is we eliminate most of the striking. but it still starts with a form of self-defense, and then you cultivate into a more type of sport and challenge and expertise. Unlike judo, there used to be all rules in judo. Now in judo, it's so limited rules that you come into an instrumental type of sport. And I think that jiu-jitsu offers something that sports don't, and that is this real closeness to being and this real closeness to what actually is, and overcoming and just being present and aware in intense moments. I would say, see here, I would say, oh, 1 second. It's also something that let's just go back to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. In Jiu-Jitsu, the Gracie family had this idea that they were going to prove the strength of their martial art by doing it, by challenging. And what they came to was a no limit, no time limit. And all they did was spend time to cultivate themselves and get into a mode of being where you have a chance to practice without worrying about failure and accepting failure. I think it's just like a really good, it's a really good cave simulator. You can throw yourself out of the cave. You get thrown out of the cave instantly, and you get to see, oh, my ego, my narcissism is this narcissism. I can't focus on escaping this guy holding me down or choking me, because I'm worried about, I'm looking over at the professor or one of my lower ranking training partners that that's not gonna help you get out. And this forces you to be in this mode and this being, and I do think it translates into real life. I've seen people who have no idea of what they're getting into, and they come out into these very enthusiastic people about it, and they don't necessarily know what it is. And I think that's one thing about jiu-jitsu too, is it is a weird thing too. There's a lot of people who think it's weird and strange, and I would say it is strange. But there's also a really relation to closeness and nearness. I think in a physical sense, I mean, especially, I think it's been really cool to see in a social distance world how far away from humanity you can get to, and how intense it's going to be to deal with that, a real type of closeness. And yeah, I come into philosophy and thinking as an amateur, but in jiu-jitsu there is a lot of community built in. I think that is the exit for the institutions, is these small communities, and like what Justin and Johannes are doing with the online courses, bringing a community of people to experiment and spar with and put their stuff out on the table is really important for people. And martial arts, I think, is one hidden thing that some people, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu seems new, but it's actually a really old thing. And I think that just hints at a lot of good to come. It's something I'm going to be working on and trying to dial in my ideas. I really appreciate you guys putting on the course, and I look forward to continuing developing it.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for that, Drew. And thank you for setting up shop in your gym. That's really cool background. Just like Kevin, it's really interesting to see everyone kind of in their domains in a new way. That's cool. So thank you very much for those thoughtful comments, Drew. Really interesting stuff. And we'll just keep carrying on then. Next up, I see Camilla. Take it away, Camilla.
Hi, coming from South Africa. I'm a medical doctor. I missed the live seminars, unfortunately, because we've been preparing for this massive pandemic that's been going on. So I have slides because I prefer you look at my spelling rather than me. So I would much prefer that. So my project is, can you see fine? Great.
Yes, you're good.
Yes.
So my project has been medical technoscience and Gestelle. And the end goal would be some kind of theology of care in medicine. This project sort of started, I would say, the first time you and Johannes talked on YouTube. And that was in October. And I sort of got the ball rolling for me to really start to think seriously about what this all means. In a COVID-19 world and a post-COVID-19 world, healthcare is going to have some real political sway. And I think it's high time that we start to look at what we're really doing while we're doing it. So I just wanted to give an introduction to the world of academic medicine, which has been increasingly technoscientific, and a lot of the academic world is saying codified in 1981 with the start of what we call evidence-based medicine, which is the common practice nowadays. It's taken evidence-based medicine now has taken responsibility for all the formal successes of medicine with regards to increasing life expectancies, longer lives, less disease, public health, and the successes there, with little regard for just the general progress of technology and understanding of disease patterns. It's enjoyed deep and considerable praise for what it's done, but has not taken responsibility for the problems it causes. Some of my assessments of the immediate problems facing medicine, besides the obvious COVID-19 crisis, I'm looking before then. What happened before medicine was brought to the fore was anti-vax beliefs that vaccines cause disease were not completely understood. These were absolutely argued as empirical beliefs, justified by studies and understood by scientific medicine, but stem from what I think is an underlying lack of trust in medicine. There's a epidemic of unhappiness amongst healthcare professionals and healthcare workers, particularly doctors, who are depressed, suicidal at an unprecedented rate. And the loss of faith in modern medicine, which has somewhat been salvaged by COVID-19. People seem to be quite impressed with us at the moment, and we'll see how that continues in the future. The major problem, and this is everywhere, is patients complaining that they are not being seen and heard. And this I believe is the real core of what I'm trying to get at. It seems like the position of the doctor who is practicing evidence-based care is sees evidence as an external universality, so that there is a world of nature which is uncovered by the tools of technoscience. That's always happening, has already happened, and continually occurs in time. So I want you to imagine the way a doctor sees himself is as Sherlock Holmes arriving on the scene with a particular set of knowledge, what on the surface is a bizarre occurrence, but he reveals with his knowledge that there is a particular sophisticated cause and effect going on underneath all of this. Sherlock Holmes possesses a vast understanding of these things, and the evidence in the reading of the text of Sherlock Holmes seems to speak to Sherlock Holmes, and he translates it for the reader. I think it's critical to understand that medicine and the world of medicine doesn't see this medical knowledge or this evidence-based knowledge as an absolute certainty. It actually seems to disavow it as not quite certain, but really good enough for all practical purposes. This next sentence is, I think, another critical part of this, is that we only see contingency in these goings on as far as the evidence is. So anything that exists outside of this pool or this growing pool of evidence, or is seen as logically, part of that, will be considered real. So anything that is not contingent, not seen as a contingent to within the field, is seen as nothing, and that means what patients complain about, what people say, that is real, but a doctor might say, that's not real at all. Doctors are less fictional, but just about as arrogant as Sherlock Holmes, and attempt to make the similar movement as he does. So evidence is actually produced by studies, but is also seen in terms of what patients complain of. And a doctor will take what a patient complains with and translate it into something he's seen in the evidence, which it's purely decided upon by an attending physician. And these are still seen as subjective complaints, even though they've been completely mediated by this external object. Now, in terms of Gestelle, which I think has inspired a lot of talk today, and it's been quite interesting for me, the patient is seen and positioned in terms of the doctor's idea of them, but is further mediated by what he feels and what he listens to, and all the CT, MRI scans, which are more and more being interpreted by artificial intelligence and machine learning. What shows up, what is exposed, and what shows itself to a doctor is a pathology. Now, pathology is not seen in this classical term of the way I've been trying to look at it, which is sort of in the current doctor's way of looking at it, it's the reason for the suffering, the cause of the disease. But in a deeper reading of pathology, of pathos and logos, both these terms go incredibly deeply into our understanding of the universe, understanding of culture, and understanding of knowledge and spirit itself. And once this is stripped away, so once this process has happened, I want to find out, what's left, because it feels to me like once this process is complete, the patient is stripped away from being. That being is removed from the patient and represented as something else in terms of this techno-scientific world. And this was said explicitly multiple times through training, and I think everyone's heard it, which is, don't forget to treat your patient as a human being, which means something is already lost. Something has already happened to take away the humanity and the being from what's before you. Rather quickly, because I'm maybe very enthusiastic about this, but my solution is a combination of what I read in the course and saw in the discussions, and also read in Hegel and so on. The way forward is to see the three components of what's interacting as self. So see the doctor as a self, see nature as a self, and see patient as a self. Hopefully a movement away from evidence as a base to the history of all three of these selves or selves as a base. What this would break away from is definitely a basis for medicine, but I don't advocate cheap moral relativism, so that any proposition can become true based on whatever bias the treating doctor may have. But it really does take a stepping back and an opening up for the infinite potentiality that occurs when things are seen as finite. So within the finitude of the patient, within the acknowledgement of death, the infinite possibilities of being that open up within them. To me, this means that care steps into the fore. Care takes its rightful place at the head of the spirit of medicine. That medicine returns to its history, which is from meditation, meditare, to meditate. And that care as contemplation and appreciation of both pathos and logos, and how they open up new ways of being and being with. That was the presentation I prepared, very brief, but thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thank you, Camilla. Very interesting stuff here. So
Yeah.
much
Thank you so
to
much.
reflect on in this short session here. Amazing. I'm going to turn off your screen
Thanks.
share. And all right, excellent. Yes. Oh, sorry about that. It's the timer. Perfect timing. All right. So moving forward then, next up, I see Raven. And correct me if I'm wrong, but is this the last speaker? Is that right? Everyone's gone, right?
Yeah,
All right.
I think
Raven,
I'm last.
you got the very special final spot. Take it away.
Great. Love that. Hi, everybody. I'm Raven, and today I'm going to be talking about virtual reality as it relates to technology and escape. I guess what I would say what I do in my life is I design experiences, right? So that's a range of activities for people to go through together, theater, immersive experiences, education. And when I'm approaching the subject of virtual reality, I think about from the position of a designer. And as a designer who is thinking about all of the different elements of experience, of all of the positions of which one can experience something immersive as virtual reality. So virtual reality is no longer a dream. It's very much present, very much a culture that now with social distancing is beginning to flourish even more than it has before. And personally, I've gone through many phases of being, a Luddite, being anti-technology, and now I'm moving more into a position of understanding the possibility space of this particular kind of technology, especially because we're in the early days of VR. So I kind of think of it like the early internet, where we had lots of blogs and all of this like chatter and activity and like optimism about what the potential of the internet could be for people during that era. And I think while maybe the long-standing hopes of those people haven't emerged, our experiences online have really been taken over by other types of forces. Those people were significantly impacted by that experience. And that's shaped a lot of what we're doing today as kind of rogue intellectuals. So I think about right now, in the early days of VR, as being a possibility for carving out new experiences and new interactions and new potential in a way that may not last. So there's also an ephemeral element to this. There's like the dystopian understanding of VR that I think Zero H.P. Lovecraft really brings forth in God-Shaped Hole and some of the rest of his work, thinking about how does sex and capitalism and the kind of hijacking of the addictive elements of our brain show up in virtual reality. Well, that's a total possibility space. And I think that considering where we've seen everything else go, that's going to be a large part of what we see in this space. But there's also this like other potential. There's this like other possibility that comes into storytelling, into the exploration of new mediums. And, as we move from one medium to the next, there's this whole process of transferring all that we already know into this new medium, as like there's a horizontal spread as people take on the tools and begin to process and understand these things themselves. And so thinking about positionality and the kind of spatial elements of Heidegger, for example, what comes to mind for me is like the possibility of creating immersive experiences that are taking abstract concepts, things that you would have to go through, text, which is like, text is a symbolic representation of what is a simulation in the minds of someone else, right? So like we go through experiential reality and we attempt to translate it and compress it and design it into symbols. And then the person on the receiving end of those symbols has to reanimate that reality in their own minds. Virtual reality basically doesn't have to go through that translation process. If I want to get a person to experience something from a different position, from the position of, I don't know, you could even go to the point of being an inanimate object, right? You're no longer dedicated to your own being in the same way that you are in reality, to the point where you could be a tree, you could be a bubble, you could be another type of person, and you can experience a new kind of perspective in orientation to the world. So there's like a quality of this medium that I think is very interesting, and the potential for it, especially as like artists or as creators of experience and as like philosophers, is extremely rich. And there's some things like I'm not necessarily advocating for it as like a total solution. I want to bring it to the table though, because I think that there's a lot of conversation about AI. There's a lot of conversation about automation, but VR is, as a subject, I don't see people considering in the same way, especially not thinking about it with AI, for example. I mean, like, kind of imagine a dystopian future where like you can deep fake using an artificial intelligence any kind of experience in virtual reality, right? So at which point you're basically like dealing with bots that you can't pass a Turing test, right? Like everybody, you don't know if you're like talking to somebody who is an AI or not. So there's all sorts of interesting speculation in this realm in terms of thinking a little bit further into the future about what could happen in VR. But then there's also the immediacy of it. There's people right now who are teaching themselves how to create virtual environments and are exploring the new possibilities of storytelling in this medium. So think about cinema, rather than you are kind of a passive observer of a curated experience that's being translated to you through two dimensions, through a series of rectangles. Rather, you are then immersed in an experience where you're participating in the unfolding of a story. And your position in the story is going to give you a kind of felt sense of whatever the designer is kind of creating or curating for you. So there's a new way of, I think, thinking about storytelling within this perspective. And more than anything else, in terms of how it relates to escape, is, and I don't know, maybe I'm crazy, but thinking about patchwork in VR actually makes a lot of sense to me, right? Like if thinking about the possibility for creating a kind of microcosm where people aggregate by preference, a lot by aesthetic preferences. You can imagine like neo-monarchists creating these like great fortresses and living there in their like cathedrals and having a system of commerce, having a community, having all of the elements that simulate the social experiences that we're used to in kind of analog reality, but rather happening in the virtual realm. And the technology in terms of like simulating and hacking our sensory systems in order to make it feel like we're in a real world is advancing. And not only that, but it kind of points to the fragility of the human, right? Like in the sense that it doesn't take that much for us to feel immersed in an experience and have it feel real, even though it may not be real in the same sense as walking in a physical world. And that brings me to another point, which is that our whole sense in terms of classifying reality is going to change. What is real within the context of VR? What is real when you step into an environment and you basically have infinite possibility for what you could experience, for what you could create, and for like who you could meet. I mean, once this begins to become, I mean, even now, you can't possibly do all the things that exist in VR. But when it becomes something much more democratic, when there are much more people on it, that is just going to explode exponentially. So there's this kind of shift that I see on the horizon. And, you know, there's the people who are going between worlds, and I would consider us to be those people. We are like, we have one foot in like the analog world. We're seeing the transition of technology. We're engaging with technology in this way that really is linked to symbolic language. It's still linked to typing on a computer. It's still linked to text and rectangle world, two-dimensional world, the translation of like embodied experience into symbols, and then the reanimation of that on the end of the receiver. That's the world that we're familiar with. But when children are growing up, with VR headsets, immersed in these experiences from a very young age, what are they going to think of reality? How are they going to understand things? And what kind of world are they going to imagine as they continue to grow? And how are we, as people sharing a world with them, going to continue to maintain some sense of connection? Already there's intergenerational conflict. And I'm like willing to say that I think we will feel more like boomers than we will feel like the children that are growing up with VR today. Like that is like the world that the magnitude of the shift here. And so I think Heidegger is really useful in this case. I also think Deleuze is, but like my interest in this course has really moved towards Heidegger because I think Heidegger takes us back to fundamental questions of being, of time, of dwelling, of thinking, of technology. I mean, I think even just opening up the possibility of thinking technics, you know, as its own kind of essence is what we need as philosophers in order to engage with this content, with these experiences, and begin to speculate. We can't use the ideas of the past anymore. We have new technology, we have new things to interact with, we have a new potential reality, we have on the verge of potentially a kind of singularity of mediums, right? Like VR is a singularity of all mediums into a single medium. What is that going to do to our experiences, the way that we communicate, how we dwell, how we think, and how we experience one another? And how is the will to will going to play itself out in this context, in this reality? How is advertising and like capitalism going to move into this mode? Is there possibility for new kinds of currencies, for new kinds of economies? You know, these are the kinds of questions that I think VR poses. And I'm excited to get into it. Like, I think, you know, if everybody else wants to maybe like stay back for a little bit, like I'll go in for you. I'll test it out. I'll write something. But I would invite everybody to begin thinking about VR from the perspective of Heidegger and of the possibilities of the future.
Awesome. Raven, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's about as good a way to conclude the talks as any I could imagine, with the potentiality of virtual realities and media singularity. I'd say that about wraps it up. Thank you very much for those thoughtful remarks. And thanks to everyone, of course, for everyone's thoughtful remarks. And we're just on schedule perfectly. So I think what we should do is we should spend the next half hour doing a few things I would suggest. I think Johannes and I perhaps might just spend a very few quick minutes giving some somewhat synthetic remarks. I dare say summarizing remarks. I think there's way too much here for either of us to pretend to impose any type of kind of really satisfying conclusion that could encompass all of the interesting materials that have been put on the table so far. But I'm sure Johannes and I could both say a few brief words about what's transpired in these seminars we've been doing, but especially in this seminar that everyone's listening along with. And then with the time left over, Johannes and I will just speak very briefly for just a few minutes, and then we can discuss some questions. And so I would encourage all of you, if in the panel, if there's any particular items that you thought were really interesting in someone else's talk that you wanted to raise or return to or make an observation or comment on, that'd be a great thing to do. So please do have a quick think about that. And for anyone in the chat who's listening, feel free to ask any questions you'd like. There were a few questions raised in the past hour or two, and I did note them, so we can go over those also. All right. So yeah, Johannes, would you like to go first, or shall I? Totally up to you.
No, you go ahead.
Sure. As I said, I'm not going to even pretend to kind of summarize or provide any particularly satisfying kind of coherent encapsulation of everything that was said up until now, but I just want to note a few themes to possibly stimulate some questions for everyone else. One thing that stuck out to me was that a lot of the interests here really converged around art and media. Not all of them, of course, but I don't think that's something Johannes and I could have predicted in advance. We didn't know that this would be especially interesting to artists and with a very particular kind of creative artistic interest and agenda. We didn't plan it that way. We didn't know that would emerge. So that's an interesting thing to observe. I just wanted to reflect on that. Whether it be Kevin and his analysis of drawing and his actual art practice using drawing techniques, to also Alex Talon and the actual production of music. But also, you know, one could think of a few other examples that came up, of course, with Drew's work. You know, they call them the martial arts for a reason. It is ultimately a kind of art form. Okay, so art is an obvious kind of recurring theme so far, and different actual media such as drawing, pen and paper, or music technology, recording devices, or VR headsets, if you will. That's one. And the other theme I just wanted to comment on or observe, just to flag for everyone, is I sense a kind of convergence on a sort of critique of what we might call instrumental rationality, following Max Weber and up into the Frankfurt School. In my view, I think this came through in the lectures, but also in the seminar series that we did, and today also. What I think is most interesting about the commonality between Deleuze and Heidegger, and there's not too much commonality, to be frank, is a certain kind of extreme skepticism towards instrumental rationality. Instrumental rationality as perhaps the way that institutions or systems, technology, if you will, kind of get its. That's how technology gets its tenterhooks in us. Something about instrumental rationality, and many of you are exploring ways in which we create practices or projects that are essentially anti-instrumental in nature. I think that's essentially what poetic existence is all about. Camilla's talk on care. Care is essentially a kind of release from the alienation or oppression of instrumental rationality. And in the creative work that people were talking about, it's often what's really at stake is escaping the constraints of instrumental rationality, and what we find on the other side, the vistas and expanded opportunities and potentiality is a word that came up a few times, that we find when we're able to escape instrumental rationality as a very particular kind of mindset that really defines modernity, capitalism, and kind of Western consciousness as we think about it. That would be just highlighting a few main themes that I think are most important to reflect on. What do you think about everything that we've heard so far, Johannes?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. That was brilliant. It was wonderful talks. Like, as we always say, as Heidegger also says, actually, the teacher is the one who learns. So now it was us to learn. Maybe let's just say a quote from Hölderlin comes to mind. Language is the most dangerous good given to man. So we have to be very careful with words. And I find it fascinating that, for example, just by retranslating and pointing, it's impossible to translate the word Gestelle because the word Gestelle does not exist in the English vernacular, but there are approximations. And by giving an approximation, that's inspired for Kevin, for example, to do some artwork. And there's something interesting in the Frage nach der Technik, in the question concerning technology essay by Heidegger, which ends on, art was called Technik. Technics. That was its name. She, it's female in the German, she was something unique in terms of unconcealing, a diverse way of unconcealing. She was pious. And that means, and this comes back to what Raven said also, that she allowed, or Technik as art, allowed to salvage and to heed truth. And then I thought perhaps what Raven said about this, VR being the one media, the media of all media, the singularity of media, as Justin put it. Maybe that's what Gestelle is turning into, right? But still, Heidegger says somewhere, and I think I quoted this in the lectures too, that he's not against technology, he's not against technological tools, etc. But there's something that we have to learn. Nietzsche says about the Übermensch, that the Übermensch is der zur Technik gereifte, is the one who is ready and ripe, who has grown to be an adult in the terms of being ready to live with technology and its tools. And what I heard from all different angles is that it would be possible. Actually, it could be a rather beautiful, accelerated way of being, where we're in touch with different ways of resonating with the world in a really elevated sense, while at the same time, if we bring it back to these fundamental questions and don't only deal with the most immediate what's there and how in just affectivity, which is something that came up quite often, but consider also the poetic way of existing. So thank you all so much. I learned. I'm going to listen to this again. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Johannes. Very, very good. Anyone in the panel chomping at the bit to squeeze in a question or a thought or an idea? because there's some time, so I would encourage you to and welcome you to. If not, I do have some questions from the audience, which we can take now. So if you want to chime in, anyone in the panel, please do just interject at any time. Otherwise, I'll propose some of the questions that were asked. And if you're out there listening to this live, I'm still paying attention to the chat. So feel free to ask any more questions while we still do have time. So one question that just came up is, it's quite specific. And this one's for Camilla. Camilla, you may or may not have an answer to this, but someone wanted to ask you your thoughts on the life and work of a 26-year-old German virologist, Dr. Stefan Lanka. Do you know this person by any chance?
I don't know. I don't know anything. I'm not a, I've honestly, most of my time has been spent outside of virology. So my experience is in radiology and interventional radiology. So I've really not read much virology. Okay,
no worries. You're not expected to know these things necessarily. So that was one question. There's another question here for Drew. Drew, the question is, many martial arts traditions have a philosophical component to them, but being a more modern tradition, does BJJ embrace such outlooks?
I would say it's a modern martial art, but some people would say, I think the history has kind of been covered up by how well it works and how good of a technology it is. I mean, some people say jiu-jitsu is the oldest martial art, and that's the main martial art. Now, I consider myself a grappler. I like to hang and hold and put people in a corner and put them into a combination of a sequence that leads them to make a decision that gets them to a point where they're finished. I think in fighting in general, jiu-jitsu is a look on fighting in general. It's not about within the bounds of the rules. There is a sense of morality of a one-on-one combative fight, whereas so I think that does come into play with its philosophy. It's not like a team fighting type of thing or a team sport type of thing. But there is something weird about it, and there's something old about it. I mean, I would assume that people were grappling before they were speaking. You know, they were learning how to hold something down or someone down before they were able to speak language.
All right, fascinating. Thanks for taking that question, Drew. Real quick, I'll just add to that there's a famous book in the martial arts called The Book of Five Rings. I don't know if you know that, Drew, or if other people know it. I don't know it deeply, but I did read it. And one of the things that he talks about in there is emptiness as part of martial arts. And it's quite interesting because that is, I think, quite resonant with what we've talked about here as kind of poetic existence. So I just wanted to kind of flag that as part of the answer to this question, although it's not jiu-jitsu specific. And yeah, and I would just say quickly also that what that means concretely for people, because it might not be obvious or it might just sound kind of woo-woo. Like when I do some BJJ, I'm nowhere near Drew here. I'm just a mere blue belt. But one of my coaches told me at one point that when you're competing, like the advice that he would give is pretty much just to you just want to pretty much be not thinking about anything. Don't get over worried about, what your strategy is or your plan is. Just go in there and be, in other words, as empty as possible. That's how I understood it. And I'm sure people have different coaching advice or whatever, but yeah, I just wanted to kind of flag that because I thought it was an interesting little data point.
And I think that's the ultimate sense of what you want to do in martial arts is you want to have your reactions respond in a way that you were surprised, but it was still the best thing you could have done.
I like that. Also, this reminds me of Mario's talk. Mario talked about distraction as perhaps being kind of one of the chief enemies in all of this. And that's absolutely true. I think in martial arts, I'm sure Drew would attest to that. And in fact, Drew mentioned this essentially. If you're thinking about other things, you're done. You're over, right? And to just simply be utterly present and empty is the essence of being non-distracted and therefore being effective and focused and yeah, effective, but in a non-instrumental way. It's actually kind of paradoxical when you think about that to be fully effective, one has to evacuate oneself of instrumental distractions, possibly. what are the rest of you all thinking by way of conclusion? Oh, I think Mark had a comment he wanted to bring onto the table. There was someone asking about this in the chat. Mark, do you want to frame the question and answer it?
Yeah, this is a point somebody brought up way back earlier in the chat when I was talking. I don't have it in front of me now, but the gist of it was this idea that we are sort of becoming post-AI, that our society itself is already achieving some kind of artificially intelligent takeoff. It's sort of like the idea that capitalism is an artificial intelligence, the whole sort of Nick Land techno-capital takeoff. And I think it is fair to see our society, our institutions, things like capitalism as gigantic information processing mechanisms. They are, in a sense, distributed computers. The market is a Turing machine. But what Heidegger has to say is that, yes, that's a perfectly effective way of looking at the world. That is how you get technology. That is a way of revealing being. But surely our society can be reduced to that, but it shouldn't. We're more than just information processors. We reveal being and unconsciously in an unsought for way as we interact socially with each other, as we dwell with each other in the world as mortals, as living a poetic existence, and as experiencing the lives of others and the world around us. So I think you can see that there is that system, that way of thinking itself is totalizing even before you get to this idea of artificial intelligence and singularity and so on.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. How about the rest of you? Questions, comments?
I just wanted to respond to something that about what Raven was talking about, and kind of like thinking about just like, I don't know, an idea for a really specific use of VR. I think that there's something really interesting about people being able to respect processes from different time periods, and I think that there's a way in which that can make them appreciate what they're in currently. And so I think that like one of the things that was a little bit that was in one way an evolution and a devolution at the same time with the visual representation of music. So people in the past used and still use notation, but once people started editing audio with visual representations of audio, they couldn't exactly think in the same way about rhythm, but they were able to think in new ways. And I think that like the idea of like VR in terms of giving someone a kind of historical empathy for different time periods. And I think like in the same way that someone, when you read like letters from the Civil War and you're like impressed by the literacy of people with middle school or elementary school educations, and you can feel other ways of talking and communicating. I think that for a lot of different technologies, there could be really helpful things about like exposing people to simulations of different processes with different technologies and give them an appreciation for what they have in a way, because I think that's one of the dangers of a lot of technology is like only seeing things as what's there for you to use, which can be freeing in some ways, but then you don't appreciate anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, if I would just respond to that and saying that a lot of like the initial exploration of VR has actually been through museums and through like reanimating historical environments. And I think that it's a very compelling way of transporting people into situations that are unlike what they are living in today. There's some questions that come up about that, though. I mean, imagine learning about the Civil War by being placed in virtual reality as a child and not really having an understanding of like how you have to be skeptical about the things that you experience, and you know, like the possibility of propaganda as like part of like the instrumental use of that storytelling in order to kind of curate you for a political reality that you know, whatever institution or whatever pre-existing society wants to prep you for. So there's all of these things, like, and that's why I do want to talk about the generational difference here. Like for us to step into VR having already experienced a world that is not VR, we can transport ourselves into a different kind of reality and still know the difference. But if you're growing up with it, and children already kind of experience magical thinking, they don't have the same kinds of lines that adults do. They're actually forming their lines. That's what development is. And to have this type of technology where you can immerse yourself in such a range of experiences, and that those experiences may feel more real or vivid than the things that you experience when you take your headset off, I think really brings up questions for how are we going to navigate between generations? How are we going to think of our own children, and think about how we can live together in this world? And, you know, I don't know. So those types of questions come up, and I think it is related to what you're saying. And data visualization is something I actually have been thinking about in VR. So much of data visualization is like trying to translate something that is very obscured in the symbolic way that's it's represented as data, but still we're mediated through a two-dimensional plane. So there's a lot of like three-dimensional geometries that you see turn. But in VR, you could literally walk around this thing, you know, and actually fully see how, I mean, think about translating sound. Like sound is being moved through a two-dimensional plane with a line, but in VR, you could see it moving from a center. You could see ripples, you know. So anyways, those are some thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for that, for sure. Anyone else? I mean, it strikes me how VR-based this whole course experience has already been. I mean, especially thinking about how amazing it was to watch Kevin move around his studio. And I was just thinking at that time when Kevin was giving his talk, how superior this is actually to let's say if we were all forcing ourselves to meet in a classroom. We wouldn't get to see Kevin in his studio, to see his work on the wall, to see exactly how he's conceptualizing these ideas in practice with machines. So in some ways, people might see having these Zoom meetings and doing an online course outside of institutions as a kind of secondary sort of substitute, some sort of poor man's, you know, alternative to the main real superior thing. And in fact, in pretty much, I mean, I would love to hear from you all, but I'm struck by how much the virtual aspect of this course experiment we have going on here has actually produced surprisingly superior qualities. In fact, with getting to see Kevin's studio and art practice live, being just one example. Yeah, please, Kevin, go ahead.
I mean, thank you for that, and it's really fun to do that. But it's also the case that there's, you know, there's a lot of hidden labor involved in that, right? And so, in the sense that I handed the phone off, you know, I'm standing on the shoulder of giants, right? The phone technology, all this stuff, you know. So we're kind of on this, you know, infinite ladder of capabilities. But, you know, so like I hand the phone off to my wife, who's a very skilled media artist, right? She knows how to work a camera. She knows how to structure a cinematic space, knows the work, knows how to kind of go in and kind of find these shots and whatever. And so there's a kind of embedded knowledge that's going on that's not just a kind of base level technological access. And so I think that, and that's fine. I don't want to overdraw that point, but I think that, you know, because those are all learnable attributes, and there'll be a kind of emerging practices and emerging aesthetics and emerging kind of techniques and stuff to deal with this. You know, but I just wanted to kind of point out that it's, you know, that it takes labor and it takes skill to make that happen. But the upshot, sure. I mean, of the kind of world of, you know, post-internet world is to, you know, what's most exciting, and, you know, hats off to you and what you're endeavoring to do, is just to, you know, just the multiplicity of experiments, right? And people just trying shit out and experiment after experiment, you know, and just seeing, like, I don't know, just TikTok. I'm in love with TikTok now. It's just this form of media mashup, you know, all this kind of theoretical ideas about mashup culture from 20 years ago are just now de-intellectualized and literalized through this like hilarious teen experimentalism, you know. And that process is just going to go on and on and on. And maybe that's kind of goes back to what Raven was saying about generational and technological change moving in tandem.
Yeah, for sure. Those are good observations. Now, what do we think Heidegger would have posted to TikTok?
his hut.
hiking videos.
Yeah, would Heidegger be like a DIY YouTuber showing, check out this hut I'm building, it's really cool. Any other thoughts, observations? We're pretty much on time. I think the pacing of all of this has been really good. We have the whole 2 hours blocked off, so we still have a few minutes if anyone wants to get anything else on the agenda.
Can I jump in with one more thing? Because I was thinking this with Alex when Alex's talk, which was really great, and I have a smattering of knowledge of that world a little bit, but and I loved what you're talking about with the the different modes of mastering, cassette, digital, and whatever, the way you're describing those spaces, and it just reminded me of this idea that something I thought about a lot a while ago, and I had this phrase called the rhetoric of resolution, that in using rhetoric in this kind of classic classic sense of like a mode of convincing, like how convincing happens, and that modes of encoding, say cassette or CD or like whatever, that they have each one has their own rhetorical power, their own way of convincing you and kind of seducing you, and as we see now with kind of this rapid technological obsolescence, people going back and falling back in love with the kind of specific rhetorical power of different modes of encoding. That was just kind of my version of interpreting what you were saying, and I thought it was really great.
Oh yeah, I mean, and I definitely don't want to make it only backwards looking, because I think that there's like really exciting ways in which people are engaging with the current formats as well, especially with like a lot of music on SoundCloud that I feel like I mean, in a weird way, also relates to music from the 90s that was getting excited about digital distortion and blowing things out in those ways. But I mean, yeah, it's going to be curious to see what the next, if there will be a next format shift, because, and I won't keep going on in this, but there is an interesting thing to consider in which we already had a format that was better than all of our formats, which was SACD, which also was a similar format to mini disc or Blu-ray audio, was actually this kind of pinnacle of audio, but no one's using it. So it's this funny thing with, you can be as an engineer very disillusioned with audio and formats because we already had access to the best format and it was rejected in favor of a more transmissible format of MP3 and these lower bitrate things. So it's kind of like there's a weird bitterness that a lot of people in the audio industry feel of like, but then there's the transcendence of being like, well, maybe that doesn't even matter. Anyway, it's a whole nother thing. But.
and I posted in, because as you were talking, I thought of this essay that I read just the other day, and I posted it to the chat. It's long and don't have to read all of it, but it's from the philosopher Robin McCoy, and he's kind of talking about Nick Land and the CCRU days. But the last part of it, the last dozen paragraphs at the end, is this incredible analysis of jungle music and kind of the sonic spaces and how they're producing those spaces. You got to read it. Just like like the last couple of screens of it, you'd be totally into it. It's very awesome.
All right, awesome. Well, big thanks again to everyone. This was amazing. Very grateful everyone came out. Very interesting stuff here. And for people out there listening to this, I would just remind you that if you're interested in any of the panelists, there's more information about them in the show notes. I will also invite all the panelists to give me links or citations of anything I might have mentioned as soon as we're done recording this. So yeah, go ahead and check the show notes to follow up on anything you heard in this talk and to possibly find out more about the panelists. And also, of course, if any of you are interested in this course that I'm doing with Johannes, we are planning on doing multiple cohorts of this over time. So we're going to do our second round of the course sometime sooner than later. So if you're interested, you can get the syllabus. There's a link also in the show notes. So just check that out. Other than that, I think I will cut off the live stream now, but to the panelists, maybe hang out for just a minute and we can debrief for a little bit privately and just kind of chat for a little bit. So to those of you out in the world listening to this or watching this, thank you very much for hanging out with us. It's been really fun. And Johannes and I are just very happy to share with you some of the final results of this amazing course that we've had. Amazing, not because of us, but because of the people gathered here today. All right, everyone, take care, and I will see you